Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ancient History Jewelry Stories, your favorite niche history podcast where I am apparently continuously pissing people off with the way that I pronounce jewelry. If you are watching this on video, then you might be a little bit confused. Today is the first time that I'm going to be making a video version of the podcast. If you are listening to this on your favorite podcasting platform, the video version of this is going to be available on Spotify and YouTube. Now, don't get too excited. This is probably not going to be the format of the podcast going forward. I don't know how to be chill on camera for more than 3 minutes at a time, and I probably will make it awkward. I don't know what to do with my hands, and I will make intense eye contact. But I have been getting so many requests for longer video content for the last year and a half that I thought eventually I would have to give it a try. And what better topic to do it for than today's podcast topic, tiaras, everything you want to know about them. Tiara Tuesdays have become such an integral part of my content. It is my favorite day of the week. A lot of people have told me it's their favorite day of the week. And I guess I never really went into the ins and outs of what is and is not a tiara, along with the history of tiaras and why people even wear them. So today we're going to be delving into the history of tiaras, along with some of the etiquette surrounding tiaras. We are so very far removed from an era when people wore tiaras regularly. I think we mostly see them as something for fancy dress up, but they do still have some use in modern society. They are not essential the way they used to be, but they are still made and they are still worn. Apparently, we all love them because Tiara Tuesdays are a huge hit. I love tiaras. Before I get into the good stuff, who am I and what are we even doing here? If this is your first time joining, welcome. My name is Melise and I am a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques. I have a video series, also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, where I look at history through the lens of jewelry, which I think is one of the most important and personal forms of art that humans have ever created. Whether or not you wear jewelry, it is an integral part of human history. Adorning ourselves is one of the earliest things humans figured out how to do. If you want to watch my video series, you can find those on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and now Facebook under the name moonhoney.jewelry or just Moonhoney Jewelry on Facebook. I have recently started putting my videos up on Facebook after taking a very long hiatus from the platform, and let me tell you, it has been something. But it's nice to have a broader audience for the videos that I make, and even though a good chunk of the people commenting are definitely in need of anger management classes, the people who are nice are very lovely. So if Facebook is your preferred platform, and I won't judge, you can find my videos there now too. If you are curious about the jewelry that I make, as I said, using mostly ancient techniques, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. Most of my jewelry is historically inspired. Yes, of course it is. Today also marks the first time that I'll be giving shoutouts to my paid Patreon members at the end of the podcast episodes. There are now enough of you that it's not an embarrassingly short list, and surprisingly, not a single one of them is related to me by blood or marriage. If you want to join my Patreon, you can find that at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. There is a free membership, but if you join for $5 a month, you can vote in polls to help me figure out what the future podcast and video topics are going to be, and you will get a shout out at the end of every podcast episode. Unless you don't want me to do that kind of thing, in which case just let me know. All of that aside, let's get into the good stuff. And just a quick note, I'm not going to be using the transition music that I usually use in this episode because it is recorded on video. It would be awkward to give you 10 seconds of freeze frame while I play the transition music. So we're just going to get right into the good stuff. What is the difference between a tiara and a crown? A crown is a full circular head covering. It encircles the entire head, it sits on top of the head, sometimes comes down lower on the brow, and it is worn by monarchs. This is no longer as strict of a definition as it used to be, but once upon a time, a crown could only be worn by a monarch. A tiara, on the other hand, is for the most part semicircular. There are some exceptions. We're going to get into that when I talk about the different styles of tiara, but usually it is semicircular. They are much smaller and they are not restricted to monarchs. Just about anyone can and did wear tiaras. We get the word tiara from the ancient Persian word for their tall, peaked headdresses. These were worn by Persian kings, and they were decorated with a diadem at the bottom, which referred to a band of purple and white decoration. Tiara and diadem have become sort of interchangeable these days, although there are some minor differences. Although the tiara as we know it today has its roots in ancient Greece and Rome, this concept predates Greece by quite a bit. I have in previous videos talked about ancient Egyptian diadems. These are usually flat bands which encircle the head. Some of them have a rearing cobra in the front. Some of them have fancy details like vultures in the back. I've talked about a few that are in the shape of a ribbon tied into a bow, which proves to us that the coquette aesthetic far predates our modern times, and they were worn mostly by royalty. The ancient Greeks and Romans made their tiaras and diadems out of gold. Often, these were made in the shapes of wreaths. These were often given as prizes for victories, whether athletic or otherwise, and they were worn to denote status. We have in the past also talked about some ancient Greek and Roman diadems that were not in the shapes of wreaths. Beautiful headdresses that would have possibly had tassels hanging from them. Sometimes they also had temple pendants hanging from them, which would look like earrings, but instead of being suspended from earlobes, they were suspended from a diadem that went around the forehead. There were also bandeau styles of tiaras and diadems in ancient Greece and Rome, which looked far more similar to the headbands that we know today. You do see quite a few examples of these in ancient statues, and it is always nice to have a visual reference for how these would have been worn, because oftentimes, when these are found, they are found in a funerary context, and there is no way to tell exactly how they would have been placed on the head. Just like in modern times, the placement of tiaras in ancient Greece and Rome would have changed with the style of the time. The ancient Scythians also had their versions of diadems. These were much broader and wider, and often featured some kind of decorative element or motif along the top. These ancient Scythian diadems would eventually go on to influence the Russian kokoshnik headdress, which would in turn influence the kokoshnik style of tiara. In antiquity, tiaras and diadems were unisex. They were worn by both men and women. They remained popular in Hellenistic and neighboring cultures until the rise of Christianity, when they started to fade out of favor for over 1,000 years. The tiaras as we know them, sparkly, shiny, gem-encrusted princess headdresses, the ones we're most often talking about on Tiara Tuesdays, really began to become more popular in the late 18th century. They were starting to become part of a woman's jewelry wardrobe, although with the tall headdresses of the time, they were a little difficult to wear. This is why you don't really see, for example, Marie Antoinette wearing a tiara. Those tall, high hairstyles with their elaborate curls, which were most often wigs, wouldn't really support a tiara the way it was meant to be worn, and often were so ostentatious that they competed with a tiara anyway. The late 18th century saw the rise of neoclassicism, when art and culture were looking back at the ancient world for their inspiration. This influenced everything from fashion to architecture to jewelry styles. With it came the first wave of archaeological revival, which is something I've discussed in previous podcast episodes at length. Archaeological revival jewelry is one of my favorite styles, and it has an intriguing and incredibly interesting backstory. Archaeological revival jewelry, as the name suggests, was really inspired by the archaeological finds being made at the time in both Egypt and throughout Europe. This rise in neoclassicism led to a vogue for headdresses. These were, of course, inspired by the wreaths and diadems of ancient Greece and Rome. The person most often credited with making tiaras popular again is none other than our favorite problematic empress, Josephine de Beauharnais, the wife of Napoleon Bonaparte. All of Josephine's tiaras would have been gifts from Napoleon, and as I have said before and will say again, the best thing that asshole ever did was give Josephine all of that jewelry. Most of her tiaras were part of what is called a parure, a larger set of jewelry with coordinating pieces. And tiaras were not always part of a parure, but during the early 19th century, they often were. Josephine not only loved to wear tiaras, but sometimes she wore more than one tiara. Sometimes she wore 3 headdresses. Her style was absolutely iconic, and quite a few of her favorite tiaras were passed down and do still survive. A number of them are owned by the Swedish royal family. With this revival in interest in tiaras, they were no longer unisex, they were worn only by women. Which is a shame. I think men deserve pretty tiaras too. Throughout the 19th century, tiaras continued to grow in popularity. They became a status symbol for wealthy women and an object of interest. It seems that tiaras started to get more and more elaborate, more and more fanciful, and they were definitely part of a woman's jewelry wardrobe. They were essential attire for attending court ceremonies, balls, dinners, galas, all manner of fancy events. And again, they were not only for the nobility. Women of wealth and status, anyone who could afford a tiara and was going to the sorts of occasions that required one, could have one, if not more than one. They were also often given as gifts to brides on their wedding day, generally by their husbands or their fathers. From around 1890 to, say, 1915, during the Gilded Age, especially in the United States, tiaras really reached the height of their popularity. Here in the US, where we do not have a monarchy or any kind of royalty to speak of, it fell on the shoulders of the wealthiest women of society to continue the trend of fancy tiaras. High society socialites, especially in places like New York City, would give what were sometimes referred to as aigrette balls, affairs that were described as rivaling even the most lavish of court balls in Europe. They were called aigrette balls in reference to a type of tiara because, of course, every woman came adorned with her own fancy diamond-encrusted headdress. After the turn of the 20th century, the Art Nouveau aesthetic really started to change what the tiara looked like. Prior to this, tiaras were mostly symmetrical. They did often include nature-inspired motifs, many times flowers, leaves. You see quite a few tiaras that feature sheafs of wheat or ears of corn, which are some of my favorites, but most often they were symmetrical. The Art Nouveau aesthetic took the tiara and turned it into an even more impressive form of wearable art. I did 2 episodes of the podcast on Art Nouveau history. If you want a deeper dive into that, definitely go back and have a listen. But there was a huge emphasis on designs inspired by the natural world. So now tiaras start to eschew this symmetry. They start to become more flourished, they start to become more fanciful. Some tiaras from this era look like ferns wrapping around women's heads. Many of them look like something straight out of a fairy tale. Some of the most iconic tiaras from this time look like nothing you've ever seen before. For instance, René Lalique's rooster comb, which I know technically is not a true tiara, but I do think that it deserves to be kept in this category. You see sinuous, curving lines, the use of color gems that weren't being used before, and a sort of unserious quality that I really appreciate in these sorts of pieces. Tiaras did start to lose their popularity after World War I. There were a few reasons for this, and I found some of these reasons to be incredibly interesting. Of course, the most obvious reason is that ostentatious displays of wealth were being frowned upon after World War I. Another reason is that women were starting to cut their hair short. Think of the classic flapper bob. Women were starting to be more liberated. They had more freedoms than they ever had before, and many young women were doing things that were considered incredibly shocking by older generations, such as chopping their hair off. This made a traditional tiara a little bit more difficult to wear. Another reason that I was not expecting was the invention of shampoo. With the invention of shampoo, women started to wash their hair more often. Clean hair has less grip, which means that it is a lot harder to wear a heavy tiara without it sliding out. I personally wash my hair once a week because I have this hair texture, and for those of you who are listening and not watching, I have big curly hair, which means I'm a perfect candidate for tiaras. But with this invention of shampoo and the growing habit of washing hair multiple times a week, it seems that tiaras would just slide right out. Because tiaras were still popular for a little while longer, the styles did evolve to accommodate the shorter hairstyles. In the 1920s, most tiaras were being made in a more simple bandeau style. Think of the classic Great Gatsby tiara. Every time you go to a 1920s themed party, you are bound to see a bunch of women wearing a bandeau either across their foreheads or on the top of their heads. Tiaras switched back from being sinuous, curving, and asymmetrical to being very geometric in the Art Deco style of the time. They continued to become even less popular going into and after World War II, but they did have a brief resurgence in popularity in the 1960s, when women were wearing beehive hairstyles, which are perfect for anchoring a tiara. By the late 20th century, the wearing of tiaras pretty much died out in the United States outside of being used for costumes, and they were being worn in Europe mostly for state banquets, coronations, and royal weddings. The good news is that since the start of the 21st century, there has been a growing demand for tiaras. High jewelry houses are claiming that they're getting more and more requests for tiaras, so they are still being made, and there are some sensational examples of tiaras from the 21st century. Not something that you would ever think I would say. Some of the great jewelry houses that have been making tiaras for centuries are at it again, most notably Chaumet, which has continued to create some of the most sensational tiaras I have ever seen, and Cartier dipped its toe back in the water. Tiffany even made one for the Baz Luhrmann Great Gatsby adaptation. I'd like to think that I'm contributing in my small way to the resurgence of interest in tiaras. I think everyone should have a fancy tiara. It doesn't need to be made out of gold and diamonds and fancy gems, just something to wear on your head when you're feeling extra pretty. So what about the different tiara shapes? Sometimes when I make my Tiara Tuesday videos, I talk about the specific tiara shapes and it gets a little bit confusing. Many of these terms are interchangeable nowadays. For instance, circlet and diadem are used pretty much interchangeably, but there are some differences. We have the bandeau tiara, which is shaped like a ribbon or band. This can be worn across the forehead or on the top of the head. These were most popular during the 1920s and 1930s. We have the kokoshnik. Those of you who have seen the animated film Anastasia are very familiar with this style of tiara. This is based on traditional Russian kokoshnik headdresses, which I mentioned earlier in the episode are based on ancient Scythian diadems. These are flat and broad and often peaked at the top. These offer a fantastic opportunity to put a wealth of gemstones on one tiara. These became very fashionable during the late 1800s, and they were not only worn by Russian royals. There was a huge vogue for all things Russian at the end of the 19th century. Then we have the circlet, which goes around the circumference of the head. As I mentioned, interchangeable with diadem. You will see these two words used for the same pieces very often. Then we have the fringe tiara. This is one that you see in a lot of royal tiara collections. The easiest way to describe a fringe tiara is a bunch of spikes, with the tallest spike in the center. Most often, these are made out of diamonds, sometimes with additional colored gems. Sometimes, a fringe tiara can be converted into a necklace. Then we have one of my personal favorites, the aigrette tiara, also sometimes pronounced egret. These focus on a central motif, which is worn above the forehead, sometimes on the forehead, and they either hold a feather or plume or are made to look like one. Then we have the halo tiara. This one's kind of self-explanatory. It looks like a halo. It's a little less common. Then we have a term that sometimes gets mistakenly applied to tiaras, coronet, and there are actually rules around what kind of coronet can be worn by who. A coronet is a small crown that would have been worn by lesser nobles and peers. Think dukes, duchesses, that sort of thing. What your title was would dictate exactly what kind of coronet you could wear. I don't know if this is truly relevant anymore, considering that monarchies are mostly symbolic at this point, but I thought it was worth noting because every once in a while a tiara will be referred to as a coronet when that is in fact a very specific kind of headwear. So I mentioned that a fringe tiara can sometimes be converted into a necklace. This makes perfect sense because a tiara is a large piece of jewelry, which means it's one of the most expensive kinds of jewelry. The amount of resources and materials going into a piece like this meant that jewelers often got very creative. You see many examples of convertible tiaras. Not just tiaras that can be turned into necklaces, but tiaras that can be turned into various brooches as well. Some tiaras come apart into multiple pieces, and often they will come with their own little screwdriver. People think that Cartier invented the concept of having hardware come along with your jewelry with the love bracelet, but the idea predates that bracelet by over a century. I love convertible jewelry, and the idea of a tiara transforming into multiple wearable pieces is just thrilling. So when do you wear a tiara? Nowadays, whenever. There aren't really any rules. In the 21st century, tiaras can be worn by anyone whenever the hell they feel like it. But in the 18th, 19th, and the first half of the 20th century, there was etiquette concerning how and when you would wear a tiara. They used to be considered an integral part of a woman's white tie attire. If you were invited to an event and the dress code was white tie, you had to wear a tiara. Of course, now most people could not even tell you what white tie even means. In royal families, young women did not wear tiaras until they were married. There were exceptions made for princesses who were unwed when they turned 18. Women in royal families would often wear tiaras on their wedding day. On the day of, they would wear a tiara from their birth family, but after this point, they would only wear tiaras coming from their husbands' families. Mourning tiaras also existed, that's mourning with a U. Tiaras that would have been made out of materials like jet or onyx in order to denote that a woman was in mourning. After the initial mourning period, when women entered what was known as half mourning, they would have been allowed to wear tiaras made out of amethyst and moonstone as well, as gray and purple were acceptable colors for half mourning. Of course, now you can buy a tiara if you have the money to do so. Whether it's a historical example, one that belonged previously to a royal family, or a modern tiara being made by a high jewelry house, if you have the money to buy it, you can. And you can wear it whenever you feel like it. There are really no rules dictating when you can or cannot wear a tiara unless you are going to, I don't know, a coronation ceremony. And if you are invited to that sort of thing, then you probably already know the ins and outs of wearing a tiara in that situation. I think it's very sad that tiaras fell out of fashion. I wish that they would make a comeback, and it does seem like in their own small way they are. And I don't think a tiara needs to be made out of platinum and diamonds for it to be special either. Any opportunity to wear even more adornment is good in my book. Hell, even fancy combs should be making a comeback. Anything you can throw on your head to add a little extra spice to your outfit. And there you have it. The history of tiaras, the etiquette behind tiaras, different kinds of tiaras, basically all the information I could give you about tiaras. If you like tiaras, which you probably do because you've made it this far, make sure that you watch my videos every Tuesday when we do our Tiara Tuesdays. Are you sick of hearing the word tiara yet? Just for full disclosure, the Tiara Tuesdays do often feature pieces that are not truly tiaras. I cover crowns and combs and all manner of headwear, but more often than not, they're tiaras. If you made it this far and you were able to stomach me saying tiaras 700 times, thank you. This has been a fun episode. Still don't know what to do with my hands though. Once again, if you want to see the jewelry that I make, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. If you sign up for my newsletter, you do get 10% off your first order. I promise I won't spam you with newsletters. I have not actually sent one out, and maybe I never will. If you want to watch the rest of my videos, that is moonhoney.jewelry on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, and just Moonhoney Jewelry on Facebook. If you want to join my Patreon, that is patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. You can join for free. All of the podcasts do get uploaded to Patreon. Or if you pay $5 a month, which is basically buying me a cup of coffee, then you will be able to vote in polls to determine the topics of future podcast and video episodes. And you will get a shout out at the end of every podcast episode, which is what I'm going to do now. So a huge, huge thanks to my paid Patreon members. It means the world to me that you are supporting me in this way. A huge thank you to Julie Spradley, Emma J. Makes, Mary Lee, Flying Chef, Liz Bouchette, Erin Atkinson, Michelle Dunphy, Bree S., Connor, Magda Chope, Catherine Elizabeth, Beth, Stannis Fluoride, Megan Rose Thomas, Mimi Fondren, Bonnie Glass, Colsey Tucker, Mink Rose, Jennifer Crosscree, Linda Yancey, Amy Radner, and Jennifer Baker. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support keeps me caffeinated enough to continue making this content. Once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all in a couple weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories.